James Lutton for Pro Boxing Fans. Delighted to be joined with Ron Katz, Matchmaker Extraordinaire. How are you, Ron?
I'm doing well. How are you guys doing over there in England?
Very good, thank you. Very good indeed. The weather's not too bad, so can't grumble too much.
Yeah, well, we're supposed to have a big storm here today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not a hurricane. What's the other thing? Tropical storm. It's just starting here in New York.
Oh, okay. Complete opposite to ourselves then in that case. We've been dry for quite a few weeks now, so we can't complain over here. Talk to me a little bit about your start into boxing. We mentioned off camera there, Butch Lewis was your first role in boxing.
Well, how I got into it, I was on the road as a company manager for the National Touring Company of Godspell, and the producer of that show was one of the founding engineers of what was known to be as closed circuit. Remember all the older fights in the movie theaters? He and three other guys developed the technology for that. He then went into live promotions in our hometown of White Plains, New York. He was friends with Butch, and I started off as really just a jack of all trades because I was not a boxing fan. I didn't know that much about boxing, but, I did a little of this, little of that, whatever he wanted me to do. So the evolution from that was that I hooked up with Butch after that because we stopped doing shows, that particular person. From Butch, I went to HBA. From HBA in 1985, I joined Top Rank for 16 years. They recruited me. And that ran until the year 2000. Did a couple things here and there in between. Then 2002, I believe it was, well, not sure if I remember correctly. Sugar Ray Leonard brought me in to do their matchmaking and director of boxing for the next 4 or 5 years. When that run ended, I joined Star Boxing, which I am with presently, but I do things for other people like, PBC and things like that, besides just matches, administrative work and things like that.
Fantastic. You mentioned there about the closed circuit side of things and one of the very first to do it. How much of a revelation was that?
Well, it was it was around. There was before then, but these guys actually developed technology where they can go worldwide and people can go, see that. So, it was huge. People could see Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, those kind of fights, go into movie theaters. There used to be 100 theaters in the state of New York. I used to handle like 3 or 4 theaters. I would go around, pick up the money, the night of the fights. In every theater for those type of fights, they were always packed with people. So, that was, the outlet for people to see those major fights, and that evolved into, cable, then that evolved into pay-per-view, now streaming. So Absolutely. That's kind of the evolution of the television aspect of the sport of boxing.
Absolutely. You mentioned there your little run through who you worked for. Probably the biggest name on there was Top Rank. Before you went to Top Rank, you mentioned there's Houston Boxing Association and obviously Butch Lewis. What are your best memories from those two companies there?
Well, Butch Lewis, I had more fun until I joined with Ray Leonard. I had more fun working for Butch Lewis for a couple of years than any time in my 43 years in the sport. The only problem is I never made a dime. He didn't pay us, but we had a great time going on the road because Butch, was very flamboyant. Ali would come on the road with us. Joe Frazier would come on the road with us, and we were like royalty, which when I joined Ray Leonard, that happened all over again because you walk down the street with Sugar Ray Leonard, the 90-year-old grandma goes, "Oh, Sugar Ray, I saw your commercial with your son." Everybody knew him. So it's like, it's royalty. And that's great just to be a part of. HBA was founded by a millionaire heiress, Josephine Abercrombie, who was in the horse racing industry. And Bob Spagnola was her point guy. And they recruited me in 1980. And we were running, 6 shows a month. We had a syndicated show on network TV here in the States, and then a cable deal that we had 4 to 5 shows a month. So that's where I really started making a name for myself. That's where I drew the attention of the guys at Top Rank, although I've always been friendly with Bruce Trampler, who eventually recruited me. And we had a great run. We had a lot of great fights. That's where I developed my reputation, really. I made my bones, so to speak.
Absolutely. But before we go on to Top Rank, talk to me about, you mentioned obviously been on the road with Ali, Joe Frazier. What were those guys like for those obviously
Oh,
who weren't watching boxing?
wonderful, wonderful, all of them, every one of them. Joe was so much fun to be around with, always playing around. Ali was Ali. Ali and I used to do magic all the time with each other. People would gather around us. I mean, it was great, a lot of fun. The legends, giants. And to be just a small part of that, to be attached to their hip, for somebody like me, that was great.
For yourself, obviously, it's your job, but do you think for yourself, how lucky you are to have spent time with those guys?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, come on, without a doubt. I mean, again, the giants of the industry, just to be around them, to be able to chat with them, to break bread with them. I mean, in my wildest dreams, I would have never thought I'd be able to do something like that.
Obviously,
So, I mean,
that's like you're still early on in your career, really. Did that, just being around those guys, did that give you more drive to continue and pursue your career?
absolutely. And I've always been competitive. I've always wanted to be the best at whatever I do, whether it be participating in sports or my job. And, again, being around, guys like that, you want it does inspire you, to greatness. Naturally, you can never achieve the greatness that they did, but, it could carve out a little niche in what I do.
Absolutely. And obviously, Top Rank, we mentioned there, Bruce Trampler. Talk to me about your time at Top Rank. You was there for a long time. What are your best memories, and what are your best fights that you matched over there?
Okay, so James, the memory ain't what it used to be, and there were so many fights. A lot of times it becomes a blur. But some of the memorable ones were when James Toney knocked out Michael Nunn, because I brought James into the fold, and he was like my pet project. George knocking out Michael Moore, obviously, was a big thrill. Things like that. Some of the major fights I can't even remember. There's been so many, but my time at Top Rank was unbelievable. I got to work alongside for a couple of years until he got ill, the greatest matchmaker of all time, Teddy Brenner. I thought I knew things until I sat next to him and got an education. And Teddy really, really inspired me because I wanted to be like Teddy. And everybody started calling me Young Teddy because of the kind of fights I would make, because I aspired to make fights like Teddy Brenner did, who taught me, try not to ever make a match that you don't want to see yourself. And that's what I tried to do. Didn't always work out, obviously. But, another memorable fight, probably one of the most memorable on ESPN that I did was actually both of them, Murky Sosa and Prince Charles Williams. The first fight, probably the only time in history where both guys were not allowed to come out of the corner after the 7th round, I think it was, 8th round, whatever it was, because the fight was just so brutal and both guys took such great punishment that the ringside physician would not allow either guy to continue the fight. And I don't think that's ever happened before. But, I had quite a run on ESPN of great fights. I mean, tons and tons and tons. So I was really proud of that. And then I was recognized by Ring Magazine, who used to give out awards. This one, Ring Magazine, was really, the Bible of boxing. I mean, it's really good now again, but they used to give out awards, best promoter, matchmaker, fighter of the year, like they do now, but like, there was only really Ring Magazine and KO Magazine. There were only 2 magazines. And, for 7 consecutive years, I think from 87 to 94, I was voted, the best matchmaker in boxing, which I still have the issues, which was really, something of a thrill to me, with the competition guys like Russell Peltz, Don Charg, and Bruce Trampler, all great matchmakers in their own right. For me to be recognized, as the best, that meant so much to me.
On the flip side, obviously, these are your most memorable fights you've made. What have been the ones that have potentially not lived up to expectations?
Oh boy! Again, you're tapping into memory banks that are untappable, so to speak. That's a great question and something I probably can't answer right now. That I'd have to think about, because that is a great question. I don't think I've ever been answered that question. A couple of James Toney's fights for sure. James with Tiberi, James with Roy Jones was very, very disappointing to me. Very disappointing because he didn't prepare properly and didn't take care of himself. I thought he had a real shot to beat him. And he was just so flat and a dud that Roy dominated him. So probably more than anybody else, a couple of James's fights.
On the topic of James Toney, you say he was like a pet project of yours. You brought him into the fold. What was it about James in the beginning that you saw that you felt was so special about him?
Well, initially there was nothing, to be honest with you, but his manager at the time, Jackie Callan, was so persistent, would call me every single day, begging me to bring him in, put him with whoever you wanted to put him with. And I watched a couple tapes of him and I said, okay, the guy's obviously got talent, but, it looks like he runs a little bit hot and cold. I watched the Sanderline Williams fight that he fought a draw with and he didn't look so good. But finally I relented and put him with Murky Sosa and he blossomed that night. He looked unbelievable. I said, wow, this guy is really something special. If he keeps his head on his shoulders, ain't nobody gonna lick this guy. And for a time, that's what happened. But then, he went south like many fighters do, and it cost him.
A lot of people will look at interviews and associate trainers to have that relationship with a fighter, not really necessarily thinking about the matchmakers, but it sounds like you had that relationship with James Toney and you had that passion for him to do well.
To be honest with you, James, I had, excuse me, I try to have that kind of relationship with all of my fighters. Some, it's impossible because, personalities, obviously. But I try to get close to the fighters, try to develop a relationship, try to develop a trust, explain what I'm trying to do, tell them, look, when the time is right, we really got to, get in there with somebody that's going to elevate your career. If you really want to make the money, you got to fight these kind of guys, and hope, that they buy into what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Talk to me a little bit about what goes into matchmaking, the old school way. How was it done? How was it introduced to you? And how do you make a fight? Is it a case of you look at, for example, rankings? How does it work for, say, world champions through to contenders?
Well, I was taken under the wing of the great Johnny Boss, the late Johnny Boss, who was associated with Mickey Duff and then brought into the fold with Mickey. Excuse me. Johnny really taught me the ins and outs and the little nuances, and then Bruce Trampler also started helping me out, teaching me things because, it was all new to me. Excuse me. So based on their teachings and then getting to know a guy like Mickey Duff, who I made my first real payday in boxing with when I put Don Lee with Tony Simpson, it was another great education by one of, the most knowledgeable guys that ever, participated in the sport. I've been lucky. I've had guys like Mickey Duff, Bruce Trampler, Johnny Boz, Teddy Brenner, Bob Arum. I mean, those, they're all geniuses in the sport of boxing. And I tried to gain as much knowledge from them and try to retain it as possible. So that helped me in making matches. And, when I go to make a match, obviously I'm looking at the two fighters, the style of the fighters, what I think is going to be a good match. If it's involving one of my fighters, is this fight going to elevate my guy? Or if I'm looking to build a guy, is this guy safe where maybe he'll learn a little something, not too much this fight, but it's safe and we'll move on to the next one. So basically that's the philosophy that goes into making matches.
How, I don't know if it's the right word or not, but how dangerous is your occupation? Because we can see some mismatches in the sport and obviously there can be dangerous outcomes and consequences. Just how vital is your role in the sport?
That's a good question because one of my fears, James, to be honest, and I always say prayers before every single one of my events to protect the fighters, let them fight well, the better man win, but most importantly, let them come out, the health and safety. That's a great fear of mine, and I've been lucky enough not to be involved with a ring fatality. I've had a few very, very close calls. But that's something that always weighs on one's mind because more importantly to me than anything else, forget the great fight, whatever, is that the two kids that are in there come out safely and okay. But, the nature of the sport sometimes prevents that.
Absolutely, and I agree. It should be the sole priority out of all fight nights. You mentioned with your fighters and the events that you put on average, how many fighters would you look after? How many people would you match for? Is it anybody under the banner you work for, or is it certain assignments you have?
Well, right now, right now we're not doing any fights, obviously, but for Star Boxing, we have a roster of fighters that include Chris Algieri, Joe Smith, Cletus Selden, a bunch of prospects, Carlos Takam, who fought last night. So, I'm responsible for making all their fights. And with Top Rank, we had Bruce on the West Coast, me on the East Coast. I was responsible for most of the East Coast guys. Bruce was responsible for most of the West Coast guys, and we intertwined with guys like De La Hoya and Mayweather and, the elite guys. It became a joint effort.
Obviously, it was only last night that Carlos Takam did fight and beat Jerry Forrest. How much involvement did you have in that matching him there? Obviously, he was a late replacement. Was that down to yourself, or was that
right? Well, the promoter Joe DeGuardi, he was supposed to fight Oscar Rivas, so he never stopped training. And then when Jarrell Miller, got popped again, Lou DiBella and Bob Arum called Joe and said, "You want to make Takam with Forrest?" Then they got together, made the deal, and last night you saw the fight.
Fantastic.
So I really didn't have any involvement with that.
And let's move on to your time with Sugar Ray Leonard. Just run me through that. What was that like, obviously, with the promotion outfit and obviously another legend of the sport?
It was unreal. And we were really cranking, as I said earlier. Ray's objective, put on the best fights, which every promoter says, when they start out, I want to put on the best fights. Doesn't always happen. But, we were lucky enough through our deal with ESPN that I was and had enough income that I was able to make some really, really good fights. And we ended up, having a bunch of guys like Paul Williams, Antonio Tarver, Verno Phillips, Bernard Dunn, Brian Valoria. We had Joe Messi. We had a ton of guys who many went on to become world champions. So we really had a great run. We were doing great numbers on ESPN. We had one show a month on ESPN. And after, 3 or 4 years, Ray and his partner, Bjorn Rebney, like any marriage or a lot of marriages in businesses, started to go sour. And eventually Ray said, "That's it. I'm fed up. I don't want to do this anymore with you." And that was the end of the company.
Obviously, we all know what Ray was like as a fighter, unbelievable fighter. What was he like as a promoter?
Great. I thought he was great because he would do whatever was asked of him, whether it be meet and greets by the casino. We happened to go out and play golf with some of their high rollers, local events to promote the show and the company. Ray would do whatever he needed to do. I thought he was very good. I just wish he would have kept at it because we were at the point where we were starting to creep close to Top Rank as far as the level of type of promoter in the business. But again, unfortunately, things didn't work out between him and his partner. And then Golden Boy burst onto the scene after we kind of disappeared. We had a lot of good fighters and a lot of good fights.
Do you think that you guys got a lot of good fighters and a good reputation because of Ray Leonard's name?
Oh, it obviously helps. plus the vehicle of having ESPN and the exposure value at that time. There was no streaming. There was ESPN and I think USA was still around at that time. I'm not sure. Then you had, your premium, HBO and Showtime, and basically that was it. So you had a great advantage.
And so now with Starboxing, as you mentioned, Joe DeGarda, how have you seen the evolution in the sport as your role in the sport changed over the years?
Say again, James, because our connections is getting a little messed up.
Has your role in the sport changed over the years at all? Have you seen an evolution in the matchmaking or in the sport itself?
Not really. It's kind of basic, and it's been the way it's always has been. But right now, the difference between now and the 80s and 90s is the number of participants, the number of quality participants. Back then, my phone would ring, 30 times an hour with guys looking for fights. And quality guys, good, solid guys. Now you really got to, search. There just isn't the amount of quality guys around, nor the amount of fighters around that there was back then.
What's it like working? Obviously, you went from top rank, and obviously with Sugar Ray Leonard, you got to a good standard. And then, no disrespect to Starboxing, but they're not on the competitive level as top rank, for example. What's it like working for a smaller company, let's say?
Reality check. Yeah. It takes, when your mindset is the way it is for so many years, and then to be kind of hit in the gut, it takes adjusting. But, we've had some, real good luck with a couple of our fighters, especially Chris Algieri and Joe Smith, that we were able to participate in some major events. So, you get a little taste of it. And now, doing my stuff with PBC that I do, I'm around, big events again. So it's, like old times. Even though I'm only doing basically, administrative stuff like medicals and things like that for them.
You mentioned Joe Smith Jr. there. Obviously, his breakout really was Bernard Hopkins. Is that a fight you matched?
Yes.
How was that?
Yes, Bernard and I have a special relationship, and I could be the answer to a trivia question. Who was the matchmaker that gave Bernard Hopkins his first loss and his last loss? And the answer would be Ron Katz.
Fantastic. Great facts.
So,
I love that.
Bernard hasn't done too well in matches, that I either put him in or negotiated. Another one being Roy Jones. We did that on HBO and TVKO at RFK Stadium. Didn't turn out to be a good fight. Both guys showed too much respect for each other. But Bernard's a great guy. Love Bernard.
What was that like to obviously have the big underdog shock there with Joe Smith Jr.?
Yeah, I didn't think he was an underdog. Fonfara, people thought he was a bigger underdog, but I was confident that if he landed, he would knock Fonfara out. But with Bernard, I told him, I said, it's going to be an easy fight. You're going to end up knocking the guy out. And that's what happened. He said he's not going to be able to stand up to your power. No disrespect to Bernard, but, he's 50 years old.
I agree.
Should have never been in the ring with him.
I backed Joe in both them fights, to be honest with you.
Underdog, you want to talk about underdog, the biggest thrill is when I made Iran Barkley with Thomas Hearns, and he knocked Hearns out the first time. Now, that's an underdog. Or when James knocked out Michael Nunn, which nobody thought except me, Jackie Callan, James, and Bill Miller, his trainer, the only ones who thought James had a shot.
Would you say they're
even Aaron, Bruce, none of them, they thought he's going to get annihilated. I said, okay, watch.
Would you say that's your biggest bit of pride and your biggest thrill in a sport is when such a big underdog with the bookmakers does win that you've matched?
Yeah, that's up there. That's certainly up there. I refer to that fight a lot because, Michael Nunn at the time was considered pound for pound the best in the world by a mile. And James was, a guy I brought into the fold and brought to that point. So, yeah.
And finally, Ron, just on the future, really. So, do you still have the same hunger you had when you started? Do you still have the same hunger for
Absolutely.
what's your,
It's
what are
in your
your
blood. You know, once this sport is in your blood, it doesn't get out. So, I mean, God willing, we'll find an answer to this terrible virus that's affecting us all over the world, and we'll be able to get back to somewhat normal way of living where people can go enjoy, the fights or other sporting events, football in your case, which I got to tell you, I was being idle for like 3.5 months, being more or less housebound. I was never, I call it soccer, you call it football. I was never a fan, and I used to get abused, on Twitter by guys like Curtis Woodhouse and them. Oh, you don't know what you're missing. So I said, let me watch one of these games like a month ago. Now I'm like DVRing every game, the Premier League, the Bundesliga league, and I'm really, really into it. And I really enjoy it. Now I can see, how, 100,000 people can get into a stadium, just go wild. So I hope we get back to those days sooner than later.
have you picked a football team to support?
Sorry?
Have you picked a football team that you support?
I'll tell you who I really like the way they play is Manchester City. MC rather. I mean, everybody said, you got to watch Liverpool. You got to watch Liverpool. And I watched the game the first time I saw them. I was expecting to see like these superstar players and everything, and they got shut out, 4-0. I said, but then the guys were all telling me, nah, they're not even trying. You should have seen them when, they were hot. But I like Manchester City for sure. I like the way they play. They're exciting to watch.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, Ron, I won't keep you too much longer, but I really appreciate your time and thank you for joining me today.
Okay, James.